Germany is marking the end of the Second World War. On the 8th of May, 1945, the heads of the German army signed the Articles of Unconditional Surrender to the Allied powers in Berlin. The day is marked as Victory in Europe Day by the Western Allies. In Germany, the day has come to be seen as the day of liberation from Nazi dictatorship. Now, the main ceremony is about to start in Berlin. It's being held at the German Central Memorial for the Victims of War and Dictatorship. And we are following the ceremony there, as we said, about to begin in central Berlin. And we have our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, with us here in our studio. And on the ground in central Berlin, following the commemorations for us, is Simon Young. And Simon, I want to start with you. Tell us more about how this day is being remembered in Germany.
Well, as you mentioned, the 8th of May is the day of liberation in Germany, as it's now referred to. This year, it's been made for the first time a bank holiday here in Berlin. And there were hopes of holding a major state ceremony, a very rare event, the highest level of sort of protocol for big public occasions at state level, but that's all been cancelled, of course, because of the corona pandemic. So what's been happening, there's been an ecumenical church service in Berlin's cathedral, and in the next few minutes, the 5 heads of the 5 major state organisations are going to lay wreaths here at the memorial to the victims of war and dictatorship. That'll be President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, Chancellor Merkel, the heads of both houses of parliament, and also the president of Germany's highest court, the Constitutional Court. And then the president, Steinmeier, will make a speech, I think, in which he'll try to draw together the strands of meaning of the 8th of May, the day of liberation, the day when 75 years ago Germany was finally free of the Nazi terror and dictatorship.
And Simon, as you've been speaking, we just see Chancellor Merkel entering the memorial there to begin this commemoration. As you said, we saw Dietmar Woidke just before her, the president of the Bundesrat, also minister-president of Brandenburg, entering. And this is, of course, an important ceremony. And Simon, how has the pandemic, as we're watching people arriving here, how has that affected what was planned for today?
As I mentioned, there was a very large event planned with 1,600 dignitaries, VIPs, ambassadors and important figures from not just from Germany, but from overseas as well. Of course, it's a day when Germany wants to remember its connections, particularly with the Western Allies and with Russia, the successors of the Soviet Union, but also to all the other countries involved in the conflict. And there were hopes of also holding youth meetings, opening exhibitions, really making a very major day. The last time anything like that was done was on the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. In 1995, when a state act was also held, a state ceremony on that level. So it's not a usual thing to do. In fact, it's very rare for such an event to be held at all. And marking this particular day today, which is, of course, filled with mixed feelings, some, including the leader of the far-right party, still inclined to refer to it as a day of defeat for Germany. But the official view, of course, day of liberation, and that's what's being marked here now. And I think a lot of the people who've gathered here, who are just out of shot, a lot of people have come down to have a look. They're a bit disappointed they can't get a little bit closer because everything here is blocked off, really also because of the corona pandemic.
And Simon, the 5 representatives are now on hand at this central memorial to the victims of war and tyranny. They are now laying wreaths at this memorial. Let's watch. the musician there, Lawrence Jansky. Again, this gathering here is Germany marking the end of the Second World War. They're at the memorial for victims of war and tyranny. And there is the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the president of the Bundestag. We just saw there Wolfgang Schäuble, president of the Bundesrat, Dietmar Woidke, walking past. And President Steinmeier is to deliver a speech that we'll be listening into as well.
Liebe Mitbürgerinnen und Mitbürger,
fellow citizens,
liebe Freunde in Europa,
friends in
liebe
Europe,
Partner und Verbündete
partners and
rund um
allies
die Welt.
around the world.
Heute vor 75 Jahren
75 years ago,
der Zweite
the
Weltkrieg
Second World
zu Ende
War
gegangen.
came to an end in Europe.
Der 8. Mai 1945
The 8th of May,
war das Ende der
1945, marked the end of the Nazi reign of tyranny,
das Ende von
the end
Bombennächten
of
und
nighttime
Todesmärschen,
bombing raids
das
and
Ende
of death marches,
beispielloser deutscher
the end
Verbrechen
of unprecedented
und des
German crimes,
Zivilisationsbruches
and the end
der
of the Shoah, that betrayal of all
Hier
civilized
in Berlin,
values.
wo der Vernichtungskrieg
Here
erdacht
in
und
Berlin,
entfesselt worden war,
where the war of annihilation was
wohin er mit
conceived,
aller Wucht
and
der
from where it
Zerstörung
was
zurückkehrte.
unleashed, and to where it returned
Hier in
with the
Berlin
full force
wollten
of
wir
destruction.
heute
Here in
gemeinsam
Berlin,
erinnern.
we had planned to
wollten
commemorate this
gemeinsam
day with others.
Mit Vertretern der
We had planned to
Alliierten aus dem
commemorate the
Westen
day
und aus
together
dem
with
Osten,
representatives of the Allies from
diesen
East and
Kontinent
West who made
unter größten
huge
Opfern
sacrifices to liberate this continent,
gemeinsam mit unseren Partnern
together
aus
with our
allen Teilen
partners from
Europas,
every corner of Europe
die unter
that
deutscher
suffered
Besatzung
under German
gelitten haben
occupation,
und dennoch
and
zur
yet
Versöhnung bereit waren.
who were willing to seek
Gemeinsam mit den
reconciliation,
Überlebenden
together
deutscher
with the
Verbrechen
survivors of German
und den
crimes
Nachfahren der
and the
Opfer,
descendants of those who
von denen
perished,
so viele
so many of
uns die
whom
Hand ausgestreckt.
reached out to us in reconciliation.
Gemeinsam mit all denen auf der
Together
Welt,
with everyone around the world
die diesem
who
Land die
gave
Chance
this
gegeben
country
haben,
the
neu
chance
anzufangen.
of a fresh start.
Wir wollten erinnern,
We had planned to remember
auch mit den
too
Älteren in
with the
unserem Land,
older
die
generation
jene
in
Zeit
Germany
selbst erlebt
who
haben.
experienced
Hunger,
that period
Flucht,
first time,
Gewalt,
who as
Vertreibung,
children knew hunger and
Alles das
violence, who were driven
haben
from
sie
their
als
homes or
Kinder
fled
durchlitten.
them.
Nach dem Krieg haben sie dieses
After the
Land wieder
war, it was
aufgebaut,
they who rebuilt
im
this
Osten
country,
wie im
both
Westen.
in the eastern and in the western
Und wir
parts.
wollten mit den Jüngeren gedenken,
And we had planned to
die
commemorate
heute
this
3
day
Generationen
with young
später
people who,
fragen,
3 generations
was die
later, ask
Vergangenheit ihnen
what
eigentlich
the
noch
past
zu sagen hat.
can teach them now.
Und denen ich zurufe, auf euch
To them
kommt
I
es
say,
an.
you
Ihr seid
are
es,
the
die die
key.
Lehren
You are the ones who
furchtbaren
must
Krieg
carry the lessons of this terrible
Zukunft
war
tragen
into the
müssen.
future.
Genau deshalb
And for this reason,
hatten wir heute
we had
tausende
invited
Jugendliche
thousands
aus
of young
aller Welt
people
nach
from
Berlin
around the world to
eingeladen.
Berlin
Junge
today.
Menschen,
Young people
deren
whose
Vorfahren Feinde
grandparents
waren
were
und
enemies,
die heute
but
zu Freunden
who
geworden
themselves have become friends today.
sind. So wollten wir an diesen 8.
That is how
Mai
we had
gemeinsam
planned to
erinnern.
mark this 8th of May
Doch nun
together.
zwingt uns die
But
Corona-Pandemie
now the corona pandemic
allein zu gedenken,
has compelled
getrennt
us
von
to
denen,
commemorate this day
die
alone,
uns wichtig sind.
separated from those who mean
denen
so
wir
much
dankbar
to
sind.
us and to whom we are so grateful.
Vielleicht versetzt uns dieses
Perhaps
Alleinsein
this state of being
für einen
alone
kurzen
can
Moment
help
noch
us
einmal
imagine,
zurück an
just for a
jenen 8.
moment,
Mai
that
1945.
8th of May,
Denn damals waren die
1945,
Deutschen
because then the
tatsächlich
Germans really were
Deutschland war
alone.
militärisch
Germany had
besiegt,
suffered
politisch und
military
wirtschaftlich am
defeat,
Boden,
political and economic
moralisch zerrüttet.
ruin, and moral
Wir hatten uns die
collapse.
ganze Welt
We had made enemies
zum
of
Feind
the
gemacht.
entire world.
Heute, 75 Jahre
Today,
später,
75 years later,
müssen wir allein gedenken,
we are forced to commemorate alone,
aber wir sind
but the
nicht
difference
allein.
is we are no
Das ist
longer
die
alone,
glückliche
and that is
Botschaft
the happy truth
des heutigen
of the
Tages.
present day.
Wir leben in einer
We live in a
starken,
vital and
gefestigten
well-established
Demokratie
democracy
im 30. Jahr
in a country that has been
wiedervereinten
unified for
Deutschlands,
30 years
Herzen
at the
eines
heart
friedlichen
of a
und
peaceful
vereinten
and
Europa.
united Europe.
Wir genießen Vertrauen
We are a
und
trusted
wir
member
ernten die
of the
Früchte von
international community and
Zusammenarbeit und
reap the
Partnerschaft.
fruits of cooperation and
rund um die
partnership
Welt.
around the world.
Ja,
Yes,
wir Deutschen dürfen
we
heute
Germans
sagen,
can
der Tag
definitely
der
now say that the
Befreiung
Day of Liberation
ist ein Tag
is
der
a
Dankbarkeit.
day for gratitude.
Drei Generationen hat es gedauert,
It has
bis wir
taken
uns
us
dazu
3 generations to
aus vollem
admit it
Herzen
wholeheartedly.
Ja, der 8.
The
Mai
8th of May
1945 war
1945
ein
was
Tag der
indeed a
Befreiung,
day of liberation,
aber war es noch lange
but at the
nicht.
same time, the
in den
vast
Köpfen und
majority of
Herzen der
Germans
Menschen.
did not perceive it as such.
Die Befreiung
The liberation of
1945
1945 was imposed from outside, and it had to come from outside.
so tief war dieses
This
Land
country had
verstrickt in sein
descended too
eigenes
far
Unheil,
into the evil
in seine Schuld.
and the guilt
Und auch
and
wirtschaftlicher
crimes that it had brought
Wiederaufbau
upon itself.
und
Likewise, the
demokratischer
economic
Neubeginn im Westteil
reconstruction and
Deutschlands wurden nur
democratic
möglich
renewal in the western part of Germany was only made possible by the generosity, farsightedness, and openness to reconciliation of our former enemies during the war.
Doch auch wir selbst haben Anteil
But
an
we
der
too
Befreiung.
played a part in the
Es
liberation
war die innere Befreiung.
through
Die
our
geschah
inner
nicht am 8.
liberation,
Mai
and this did not take place on the
1945,
8th of May 1945. It was not done in a single day.
sondern sie war ein
Rather, it was a
langer,
long
schmerzhafter
and
Weg.
painful
Aufarbeitung
process,
und Aufklärung
which involved facing up to the past, looking long and hard at what people knew and what they had
quälende
colluded
Fragen in
in,
den Familien,
raising tormenting
zwischen den
questions within families
Generationen,
and between the generations,
der Kampf gegen das
fighting
Verschweigen.
to stop silence
Verdrängen.
and denial from
Es waren
prevailing.
Jahrzehnte, in denen viele
It took
Deutsche meiner
decades,
Generation
decades in
erst
which
nach
many
und
Germans
nach
of
ihren
my
Frieden
generation only gradually
mit diesem
learned
Land
to
gemacht
find their
haben.
peace with this
Es
country.
waren auch Jahrzehnte,
Decades,
die
too,
bei unseren
in which our
Nachbarn neues
neighbors
Vertrauen wachsen ließen.
slowly learned to trust us again, decades that allowed a cautious resumption of
europäischen
relations,
Einigungsprozess
leading to ever
zu den
closer
Ostverträgen.
union between the European
waren
community to
Jahrzehnte,
the
in
treaties
denen Mut und
concluded in the wake
Freiheitsliebe
of West
im
Germany's
Osten unseres
Ostpolitik.
Kontinents
And it was in these decades that the people of Eastern Europe's courage
bis hin
and desire for freedom
zu jenem
swelled until they would
glücklichsten
no
Moment der
longer be kept
Befreiung,
behind walls,
der friedlichen
leading to that
Revolution
happiest moment of liberation,
und der
Germany's
Wiedervereinigung.
peaceful revolution
Diese
and
Jahrzehnte
unification.
des Ringens mit
These
unserer
decades of
Geschichte
struggling
waren
to come to terms with our
Jahrzehnte,
history
in denen die
were
Demokratie in
decades that
Deutschland
allowed democracy to mature in Germany.
Dieses Ringen,
It is a struggle, though,
dieses Ringen bleibt bis
that
heute.
continues to this
Es
day.
gibt kein Ende des
A
Erinnerns.
remembrance
Es
can
gibt
never
keine
end.
Erlösung von unserer
There can be
Geschichte.
no deliverance from
Denn
our
ohne
past, for
Erinnerung
without remembrance,
verlieren wir
we
unsere
lose our
Zukunft.
future.
Nur weil wir Deutschen
It is
unserer
only
Geschichte
because we
ins Auge
Germans
sehen,
face our
weil
past
wir die
and
historische
because we
Verantwortung
accept our
annehmen.
historic
Nur
responsibility
deshalb
that the
haben die
peoples of
Völker
the
der
world
Welt unserem
have
Land
come to trust our
neues
country once
Vertrauen
more.
geschenkt. Und deshalb
And this
dürfen
is
auch
why
wir
we,
selbst uns
too,
diesem
can
Deutschland
have
anvertrauen.
confidence in this Germany.
Darin liegt ein aufgeklärter,
This is the core of an
demokratischer
enlightened,
Patriotismus. Es gibt
democratic
keinen
spirit
deutschen
of patriotism. There can
Patriotismus
be
ohne
no
Brüche,
German
ohne den
patriotism
Blick
without
auf
fracture,
Licht,
without a
und
clear awareness of light
Freude
and darkness,
und Trauer,
joy and
ohne
sorrow,
Dankbarkeit
gratitude and shame.
und Scham. Rabbi Nachman hat
Rabbi
gesagt,
Nachman once wrote,
kein Herz ist so
"No
ganz.
heart is
wie ein
as
gebrochenes
whole
Herz."
as a broken heart."
Die deutsche Geschichte ist eine gebrochene
Germany's
Geschichte
past is a
mit der
fractured past,
Verantwortung für
bearing
millionenfachen Mord.
responsibility for the murder of
und
millions of
millionenfaches
people and for the suffering of millions of
bricht uns
people.
das Herz
That breaks
bis
our
heute.
hearts to this
Deshalb
day.
Man kann dieses Land
And that is why I
nur
say
mit gebrochenem
that
Herzen lieben.
this
Wer
country
das
can
nicht
only be
erträgt,
loved with a broken heart.
wer einen Schlussstrich
Those
fordert,
who
der
cannot
verdrängt
bear
nicht
this,
nur
who
die
call for a
Katastrophe,
line to be drawn under our
von
past, are
Krieg
not
und
only
NS-Diktatur.
denying the cataclysm that was the war and the Nazi
all das Gute,
dictatorship,
das wir seither
they are also
errungen haben.
devaluing
Er
all
verleugnet
the good
sogar
that has since been
den
achieved
Wesenskern.
and denying indeed the very
unserer
essence of our
Demokratie.
democracy.
Die Würde des Menschen ist
Human
unantastbar. In
dignity
diesem
shall be
ersten Satz
inviolable.
unserer Verfassung
This first sentence of our
ist und
Constitution
bleibt für alle
remains a
sichtbar
reminder
eingeschrieben, was in
inscribed for
Auschwitz,
all to see
was
of
in
what happened
Krieg
in
und Diktatur
Auschwitz,
geschehen ist.
of what happened in the war and during the dictatorship.
Nein, nicht
No,
das Erinnern ist
it is
eine
not
Last,
remembrance that is a burden.
das Nicht-Erinnern
It is
ist
the
eine
lack of it that becomes a
Nicht das
burden.
Bekenntnis zur
It is not
Verantwortung
affirming
ist eine Schande,
responsibility that is shameful.
das Leugnen
It is
ist eine
denial that is shameful.
Doch was
But
bedeutet
what
unsere
does our
historische
historic
Verantwortung
responsibility mean today,
heute, ein Dreivierteljahrhundert
3/4
später?
of a century after the
Dankbarkeit, die
fact?
wir heute
The
spüren,
gratitude we feel today,
die darf uns nicht bequem
it must
machen.
not
Im
make us
Gegenteil.
complacent. Quite the opposite. We must never forget that remembrance is a challenge and a duty. Never again, we vowed after the war. But for us Germans in particular, this never again also means never alone again. And this sentence is truer in Europe than anywhere else. We must keep Europe together. We must think, feel, and act as Europeans. If we do not hold Europe together, not least during and after this pandemic, then we will have shown ourselves not worthy of the 8th of May. If Europe fails, then never again fails with it. The international community learned from this never again. After 1945, it forged a common foundation from all it had learned from this cataclysm, declaring human rights and international law and rules to preserve peace and cooperation. Our country, from which evil once emanated, so much evil, has changed over the years from a threat to international order to one of its champions. We must not allow this order that promotes peace to disintegrate before our eyes. We must not allow ourselves to become estranged from those who established it. We want more cooperation around the world, not less, not least when it comes to fighting the pandemic. The 8th of May was a day of liberation. In my opinion, these famous words of Richard von Weizsäcker must be reinterpreted in today's world. When he spoke them, they constituted a milestone in our efforts to come to terms with the past. But today, they must point to our future as well, for liberation is never concluded here. And it's not something that we can just experience passively. It challenges us actively, every day anew. In 1945, we were liberated. Today, we must liberate ourselves from the temptations of a new kind of nationalism, from a fascination with authoritarianism, from distrust, isolationism, and hostility between nations, from hatred and hate speech, from racism and contempt for democracy, for they are merely the old evil in a new guise. On this 8th of May, we commemorate the victims of Hanau, of Halle, and of Kassel. They have not been forgotten in the midst of the corona pandemic. If it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. These words were spoken by Israel's President Reuven Rivlin on the Holocaust Remembrance Day in the German Bundestag earlier this year. If it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. But today, there is no one who can liberate us from these dangers. We must liberate ourselves. We were liberated, freed to become responsible for our own actions. I'm well aware that this year, the 8th of May, comes at a time of great upheaval and great uncertainty, not just because of the corona pandemic, but very much exacerbated by it. We do not yet know when and how we will emerge from this crisis, but we know the spirit in which we entered it, with great confidence in this country, in our democracy, in what we can shoulder together. And that shows how incredibly far we have come in 75 years. And it gives me hope for all the challenges ahead. We cannot come together for a commemorative event because of the coronavirus. But let us use the opportunity that this silence gives us. Let us pause to reflect. I ask all Germans to remember silently today the victims of the war and the victims of the Nazi regime. Wherever your roots may lie, take a moment to visit your memories, your family's memories, to explore the history of the country in which we all live. Think what the liberation of the 8th of May means for your life and your actions. 75 years after the end of the war, we Germans have much to be grateful for. But none of the positive achievements since then are safe in perpetuity. So on this note too, the 8th of May was not the end of the liberation. Preserving freedom and democracy remains our legacy.
We've just been watching a German President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, delivering a speech here in central Berlin, a solemn ceremony marking the end of the Second World War. It is a day that here in Germany is seen as a day of liberation from Nazi dictatorship, from tyranny, from fascism. And we see Chancellor Angela Merkel on hand there, the presidents of both of the houses of parliament, also the president of the Constitutional Court. They are at the central memorial to the victims of war and tyranny. And that is it, essentially. We heard the German president say a far broader commemoration ceremony was planned with survivors, with witnesses from the time of the war, but also with young people, the people who have to carry these memories forward. But it perhaps added to the very solemn nature of the ceremony that just these five were on hand, and the musician, of course, as well. And our correspondent Simon Young has been listening into the speech following the commemorations for us. Simon, want to get your thoughts on what we heard from the German president.
Well, certainly a very moving and solemn speech from the German president, and I thought it was interesting he picked up on that point about the corona pandemic and the changes that it has brought on these ceremonies. He said, you know, we wanted to commemorate with our allies and with old and young Germans and draw the lessons from the past, but we can't really do that in the way that we wanted to do with a big ceremony that would have really projected that meaning because of corona. He said it's a little bit of an echo perhaps of that time, that the loneliness that people have felt in recent weeks. In 1945, Germans were alone, he said. We had made ourselves the enemies of the entire world. And, you know, I thought that was an interesting resonance. He also talked about, although we refer to the day of liberation, we must remember that there can be no release from the lessons of history. It's because Germany has faced up to its past so consistently in recent decades that it has won the respect, he said, of nations around the world. So these are very important messages that Frank-Walter Steinmeier has made before, but I thought it was very moving to see him there on the steps of the Neue Wache saying that kind of thing again.
Indeed, Simon, a very moving speech. Our correspondent Simon Young, as we said, on the ground covering commemorations for us. Simon, we'll leave it there with you. Thank you very much. And Melinda, our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, with us here in studio. Melinda, I also want to get your thoughts. As Simon said, we heard, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier touching on a bunch of points that he has in the past as well, but it was especially moving in this moment.
Absolutely, it was. And as Simon just said, that image of those five sitting spaced so far apart in a completely empty center of Berlin. I have to say, coming here on my bicycle this morning, I have rarely seen that central part of Berlin as empty as it is today. And he said, we were alone in 1945. We are not alone now. And I think that, for me, was a very powerful part of this speech, his testimony to multilateralism and to Germany's role and place in Europe. And the fact that May 8th, 1945 marked a new beginning for Germany, also in the sense that going forward, it could become part of this larger community of nations once again, when it had been an outcast. So that was one point. Another one was, as Simon also talked about, remembrance being something that never ends. He essentially tells us that Germans are responsible for an ongoing process of remembrance and of self-liberation. And I found that quite interesting. He said it was a long and painful process. And what he has in mind there is something that Germans have coined a special term for. It's called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, confrontation with the past. And the way that Germany marks this day is absolutely a measure of how it has done that kind of a confrontation, decade for decade, beginning especially in the 1960s, as Germany began to really face up to its crimes during the Holocaust, and continuing right up to the present, but with a real milestone on this day. In 1985, when President Richard von Weizsäcker said those words, this was a day of liberation for all Germans. And that's something that really is the gold standard of speeches on this day.
Well, we might have some viewers internationally wondering, why does Germany see it then as a day of liberation, not a day, for example, of unconditional surrender?
Really, it's both. And I think another very moving moment of this speech was when the president told us to love Germany, you can only love Germany with a broken heart. You could also say you can only love Germany if you have a high tolerance for ambivalence and ambiguity, meaning it was both a day of annihilation and redemption, as in fact Germany's very first president said as early as 1949. He called it both of those things. And basically, since then, there has been an ever-rising sense that this liberated Germans because it freed them from tyranny, but they had to become part of that process themselves. And this is what the president reminded us of. And this confrontation with the past, what President Richard von Weizsäcker said in 1985, looking the truth straight in the eye, has been a real hallmark for Germany of coming to accept this day as something that liberated them and that at the same time was a defeat for the Germany of 1945.
All right, our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, will be talking a little bit more about that confrontation with the past a little bit later in the program. Thank you for your insights. Well, you're watching special coverage of Germany's commemoration of the end of the Second World War. We just heard, as we said, a German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, speaking. And in a little bit, we'll look at how the date has been marked in France and in the UK. But first, here's a look back at the events that led to the defeat of Nazi Germany.
The Allied landings in Normandy began on the night of June the 5th, 1944. The strategy was to trap the German forces by opening up a second front to the west. For the Allies, there was a terrible price to pay. In January 1945, the Soviet Red Army liberated Auschwitz concentration camp. Most of the prisoners had already been deported by the SS. More than 1 million, mostly Jewish inmates, were murdered in the camp. By February, Soviet troops were engaged in house-to-house fighting. Kostrin on the River Oder in Poland was the bridgehead for the assault on Berlin. Early that month, Allied commanders met in Yalta on the Crimean Peninsula. Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill sat down to decide how Germany would be carved up and the future shape of Europe. In mid-February, British and American bombers dropped 4,000 tons of munitions on the German city of Dresden, setting off a hugely destructive firestorm, which killed 25,000 people. By mid-March, the British and Americans occupied the whole of the west bank of the Rhine. German attempts to destroy the bridge at Remagen on the east bank were doomed to failure. US and Red Army troops converged in late April in Torgau on the River Elbe. A symbolic handshake showed the world that Germany's eastern and western fronts were broken. The end of the Second World War was approaching. The 30th of April 1945 was a historic day. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin, his body cremated in the garden. The bloody battle for Berlin was entering its final stage. Late that evening, Soviet troops stormed the German parliament and raised the red flag, a symbolic gesture which brought the Soviet Union's terrible sacrifices to an end. A week later, on May the 8th, came Germany's unconditional surrender. The Second World War was over. Europe liberated from the yoke of fascism.
Well, because of the coronavirus pandemic, many commemoration events have been scaled back or moved entirely online. And that is the case in Paris as well. President Emmanuel Macron took in an event on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, though without the usual parade down the avenue. He laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, but only a small group of dignitaries were in attendance. Let's bring in our correspondent in Paris, Lisa Lewis. Hi, Lisa. As we said, there was a low-key commemoration today, but how relevant is the marking of the end of the war to French people?
Well, absolutely. There were only 20 people present compared to 3,000 to 4,000 normally. There were also other commemorations happening across the country, local dignitaries laying down wreaths in villages, at town halls. But obviously, it's still quite important to people here, especially veterans associations. The French have been putting up the French flag at their windows or balconies, have been posting pictures of that online. And veterans associations are reminding people of the fact that this might be the last large anniversary, the 75th anniversary, of people actually attending, or who might have been attending actually, who saw what happened and who were there in 1945. And that also during this coronavirus pandemic, lots of elderly people, about half of the about 25,000 deaths here in France so far have been elderly people in care homes. And those were some of the last survivors of World War II, really.
And Lisa, it is really remarkable when you think 75 years later after VE Day, the relationship between France and Germany is so essential. It's really a bedrock of the European Union as well. Is there a sense that that relationship will continue to deepen, especially with the UK leaving the European Union?
Well, that's obviously what France and Germany will continue to keep doing and they will try to deepen that relationship. It's not going to be easy, though. Emmanuel Macron, the president here in France, has been trying to push through market liberal reform since he came to power in 2017. But resistance to that has been mounting, actually. He's been losing support amongst the French. Now, with the coronavirus, France, as well as other countries in Europe and across the world, will face a huge economic crisis, and it will get more and more complicated for him to keep carrying out these reforms. So it might be more difficult for him to find an understanding with Germany that's obviously very linked to and really wants to push through budgetary discipline.
And Lisa, coming back to the significance of this day, we saw, as we said, that solemn ceremony earlier today with the French President, Emmanuel Macron. But how much is this day celebrated among French people? What does this mean to the French people?
Well, there have been people on social media, online, obviously, who have been saying this is really important. We're really happy that Nazi Germany got defeated in 1945. As I said, people have been putting up flags at their balcony, at their windows. And normally thousands of people keep attending these ceremonies each year. So it is an important day in the life of the French.
All right, our correspondent Lisa Lewis reporting there from France. Thank you very much. Well, those were images of a 2-minute silence held in the UK to mark the end of the Second World War. And our correspondent Birgit Maas is standing by for us in London. Hi, Birgit. The events are also a bit smaller in the UK this year because of the pandemic. But how are people marking this date?
Well, exactly, Sumi. Not as grand as they would usually be, with thousands of people in the city centre, with veterans walking past, much more small scale. And people were encouraged to celebrate at home. In my neighbourhood, this 2-minute silence was observed. Many of my neighbours came out, and I think it was a sombre moment of really quiet reflection and something that brought the country together in a way. So we also saw the Royal Air Force fly past. And throughout the day, there will be smaller moments of commemoration. Boris Johnson is going to speak. There's going to be a nation's toast where people are encouraged to raise a glass and think about the veterans. Do this at home, of course. And then in the evening, there will be a televised address by the Queen. Yeah, so throughout the day, smaller moments of commemoration on this really important day in the UK's history.
It is an important day, Birgit. If you remember the images of London, 75 years ago today, people celebrating on the streets, it is many years later. So just how relevant is this memory to people in Britain today?
A lot of people that I have spoken to have stressed that they're really reflecting on the values that are important today. How do we live our lives today? So not just about the victory, but really about cooperation, about community. The end of the Second World War in the UK saw the beginning of the welfare state. It saw the birth of the national health system that is there for everyone, and that just at this hour during the coronavirus is really so relevant in many people's lives, and people regularly come out now to clap for the carers, clap for everybody who's helping to defeat the virus. So a lot of people really using this day to reflect on how do we live today, how do we want to live, and also how do we want to live when we come out of the crisis. Of course, a moment of great uncertainty, but also I think for a lot of people a chance to start something new and to start about how this crisis can change the shape of the country that we live in.
And Birgit, what about how people in Britain see their place in Europe, their relationship with European partners now, 75 years later?
Well, yes, of course. The Second World War is really a national myth. It was a moment of triumph that has a very deep ingrained part of how Britain see itself. And many people have pointed out that it was, of course, also relevant to the victory of Brexit, this myth that Britain can go it alone. Other people, though, are stressing that today things are very different and that the virus actually brings home the necessity of collaboration, that the world is interdependent. The search for a vaccine is very international and that the virus knows no borders. So people will be using this crisis and this moment in very different ways.
All right, our correspondent Birgit Maas reporting from London. Thank you. Well, Russia marks the anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany on the 9th of May, and that's because when the Articles of Surrender were signed late in the evening on May the 8th in Berlin, it was already past midnight in Moscow. Now, in the run-up to the commemoration, Russia traditionally reburies the remains of Red Army soldiers who have been recovered from World War II battlefields. Now, this ceremony took place near the city of Rostov. More than 26 million Soviet citizens died during the Second World War, including more than 8.5 million military personnel. And let's go right to our correspondent, Yuri Rishetto in Moscow. Yuri, good to see you. So how is Russia commemorating this 75th anniversary of the end of World War II?
Hi, Sumi. So for the Russians, this anniversary is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, festivity of the year. The children are traditionally told about the war in kindergarten already. Almost every Russian family has personal memories of what is called the Great Patriotic War here. Although there are hardly any veterans from that time left, many eyewitnesses are still alive. And so people tell very personal stories in their families. I personally heard about the war from my grandfather, who is no longer alive, and from my mother, who was a little girl during the war and remembers what it was like back then. Of course, people will celebrate Victory Day at home with their families and loved ones. Tomorrow morning there will be an air show with military planes here in Moscow as well.
Yuri, 75 years later, what role does this Second World War play in how Russia sees itself and its role also in look towards Europe today?
Well, look, Russia traditionally celebrates the end of World War II with a large military parade on Red Square, which has been postponed this year because of the coronavirus, and a new date hasn't been set yet. However, it's a tradition that goes back to the Soviet Union. Above all, it shows off military power, which of course goes hand in hand with political power. The Russian President Vladimir Putin uses this day to shine as the president of a winning state, and the milestone anniversary this year should have been one of the most important political events for Putin personally. We know that participation in the parade has been boycotted by Western states since the 2014 annexation of Crimea. And so, of course, Putin has hoped the boycott would finally be lifted this year for the 75th anniversary. But then the coronavirus put a stop to Putin's grand plans to end Russia's political isolation.
And Yuri, what about specifically Russia's relationship with Germany today?
Well, I think German-Russian relations are still very good, 75 years after the end of the war. They had their heyday in the early 2000s. The Russian economy was booming and trade relations were extremely good between the two countries. After that came the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the allegations of Russian interference in the US elections. The US and the EU imposed sanctions on Russia over the Ukraine crisis, which has caused a real shadow on relations between Russia and Germany as well. There was never warmth between President Putin and Chancellor Merkel, but the two leaders have managed to maintain a constructive dialogue, despite all their political differences. President Putin was hoping for Chancellor Merkel to be one of the leaders to attend the parade on Red Square here in Moscow, because, of course, Russia remains a very important partner, not only for Germany, but for all countries in the EU, above all when it comes to global security and to the economy, but also when it comes to cultural relations. Russians still have a lot of respect for the Germans, and the Germans are still very interested in Russia.
All right, our correspondent Yuri Rishetto there from Moscow. Yuri, good to talk to you. Well, you are watching our special coverage of the commemorations of the end of the Second World War here in Germany and across Europe. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier spoke in Berlin just a short while ago. Here's a part of that address.
Here in Berlin wollten wir heute
We had planned to commemorate this day jointly with others. We had planned to commemorate the day together with representatives of the allies from East and West who made huge sacrifices to liberate this continent. Together with our partners from every corner of Europe that suffered under German occupation and yet were willing to seek reconciliation. Together with the survivors of German crimes and the descendants of those who perished, so many of whom reached out to us in reconciliation. Together with everyone around the world who gave this country the chance of a fresh start. That is how we planned to mark this 8th of May together. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has compelled us to commemorate this day alone, separated from those who mean so much to us and to whom we are so grateful.
All right, back with our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, for more on that speech that we heard earlier. Melinda, we've talked about this being seen as a day of liberation in Germany. That's something that was reflected in the speech from President Steinmeier. But do Germans actually perceive it as such?
They seem to do. Deutsche Welle did a poll this week in which more than 3/4 of the Germans who were polled said that they absolutely see it as a day of liberation. Only 7% said they see it as a day of defeat or capitulation. But interestingly enough, if you then break that down by party affiliation, you see that over 30%, around 31% of those polled who say that they support the right-wing party, the Alternative for Germany, AfD, they say it was a day of defeat. So when you hear populist politicians, especially Alexander Gauland, one of the leaders of that AfD party, calling it a day of defeat and denying that it should be celebrated as a holiday, as a day of liberation, they are absolutely speaking to that 30%, a 30% who perhaps cannot easily tolerate what I talked about earlier as the ambivalence of Germany's history.
Those were comments from Alexander Gauland from the AfD that sparked a lot of controversy this week, right?
Indeed, because, in fact, this is a holiday today in Berlin, but it is not a national holiday, and it is not an ongoing holiday. This is a one-off holiday, so to speak, for Berlin. So there have been calls by Holocaust survivors, but also by political parties in Germany, to make it a national holiday going forward. He absolutely, adamantly rejects that. And there are arguments on both sides of this. Certainly, Germany's role is complex. As I mentioned earlier, the very first German president saying it was a day on which Germany was both annihilated, that is to say, Nazi Germany, and redeemed. So to mark this day with a holiday requires a very careful construction where certainly it isn't seen as a day of celebration because that kind of a past can hardly be celebrated. It can be commemorated.
We are just seeing these pictures again that we were following a little bit earlier as they were happening live. We see German Chancellor Angela Merkel there and Wolfgang Schäuble, who we also saw in an interview earlier today with German media saying, I absolutely do see this as a day of liberation. That's how I perceive it. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the president, we've seen him speak at a number of commemorations over the past year. There was the anniversary of the invasion of Poland, the start of World War II, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the bombing of Dresden, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Has his message really continued to be the same through all these very important milestones?
I think it has. And what he does very, very well is to put this in that historical context and to really make clear that Germany has a responsibility, as he said here today, to carry on the process of remembrance, that it never ends, that it has an ongoing responsibility to confront its past and to live the lessons that it learned from those. And here, I think he spoke so movingly about never alone again. World War II was a completely isolating experience for Germany, and he made that clear at the start of his speech, and we saw it visually, those 5 people seated so far apart, in a way reminding us of what aloneness can look like and feel like. And when he talked about never alone again, he absolutely paid testimony to tribute to the important role that Germany has in Europe and the responsibility that it has for ensuring that the European Union can thrive. And that is an incredibly important responsibility now in this time of the pandemic when many European countries have been hit very, very hard by the economic consequences and where Germany will definitely need to put some deeds, some actions behind those words that we heard Frank-Walter Steinmeier speak there and at many of the other commemorations you mentioned.
Well, because we've seen so many of these important milestone commemorations over the past year or so, we've been talking here in Germany in particular a lot about memory politics, a culture of remembrance, what that means and how that should be carried forward. And we heard the German president say it's only because we face our past that people trust us now. How is that seen among the wider German public? Because the reality is a lot of the witnesses from these periods that need to be remembered are no longer going to be around in the near future. I mean, how is that seen among the younger generation, for example?
There's been an enormous effort as part of this process of confronting the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, this complicated German word, to bring survivors teachers into the schools, to bring into the schools people who can really tell the story and make it personal. And German pupils and students learn a great deal at different points in their education about the past. Now, I don't personally believe that when the last survivors do die, and many of them are now in their 90s, that that will mark an end of this culture of remembrance. I am convinced that it will go forward. But there are people on the right side of the political spectrum who sometimes can be heard to say, we need to draw a line under our past. And we both remember, I think, the statement by an AfD party leader saying, those 12 years, they were just a little speck of bird poop in the larger picture of German history. Now, that is a minority point of view, but it is out there.
All right, well, let's take a closer look now at why that remembrance is important with our next report. Simon Granovsky only managed to escape the Auschwitz concentration camp by sheer luck. The Belgian resistance fighters stopped the deportation train he and his mother were riding in, and 75 years after the end of the Second World War, the 88-year-old is living through another worldwide crisis, the coronavirus pandemic. Now in Brussels, this Holocaust survivor is tapping into his talents to spread joy during this uncertain time.
A bit of jazz music drawing people out of their homes. A rather unusual picture in times of COVID-19.
I play because it makes me happy to bring a bit of happiness and hope to the people, and to cheer them up.
Simon Granovsky says jazz is his life. Music helped him to overcome the trauma he experienced as a Jew in Belgium during the Second World War.
As a child, I lived through the persecution of the Nazis' barbarism. They killed my mother and my sister in the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. My father died in despair just after the war, in July 1945. When I was 11, the Nazi secret police, the Gestapo, took me and threw me in prison.
The Nazis put Granovsky and his mother on a deportation train. More than 1,500 people crammed in cattle cars. Destination, Auschwitz concentration camp. But he was lucky. 3 Belgian resistance fighters stopped the train. His mother told him to flee, and he ran into the night. She didn't jump because she didn't want to threaten his escape, he says.
Every night I dreamt I was being chased by the Gestapo. 2 or 3 times I changed families for security reasons. Whenever I arrived somewhere, I went to the attic first to see how I could escape over the roofs if they came to get me.
After the war, Granovsky returned to Brussels and made good on his dream of studying law.
At 23, I was a doctor of law and a lawyer. I'm still a lawyer today because I'm far too young to stop.
Granovsky says he has been confined twice in his life, once during the war and now due to COVID-19. Very different experiences. But it was always jazz music that helped him to cope.